The night before my wedding, I walked into my father's study and found my fiancé, the man I was set to marry in less than 12 hours. Pouring whiskey into a glass with my half-sister, curled up on his lap, her fingers sliding into his hair as if she'd always belonged there. She saw me, standing in the doorway, didn't even flinch, just smirked like she'd won something. My father looked up from his desk like I was the one who'd interrupted a family meeting. And then he said something I'll never forget. "Carrie, don't make a scene. It's already been decided." That was the moment I realized my entire life had been rehearsed without me. Before I tell you the rest of how everything unraveled, how I went from bride-to-be to family pariah, to the woman who burned it all down and built something stronger, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and how many of you have faced betrayal in some form too. And hey, if this is your first time here, welcome. We tell true stories that shake the soul and sometimes make your jaw drop. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about people who refuse to stay broken. Now, let me tell you how my perfect life was just a script someone else had written, and how I finally learned to rewrite it. My name is Caroline Monroe, but most people just called me Carrie. 33, middle school counselor, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, showed up to PTA meetings even before I had kids of my own, and still baked cookies for neighbors at Christmas. I lived in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house that backed onto a marsh, so still some mornings you could see God's reflection. My life wasn't flashy, but it was stable, safe, or so I thought. My father, Randolph Monroe, was the kind of Southern businessman who thought legacy mattered more than truth. He owned Monroe Timber and Export Co., a company older than I was by 2 generations, and growing up, I always believed I'd be his chosen successor. But somewhere along the way, that faith unraveled like fraying thread. It began subtly, the way these things always do. Small shifts in attention, fewer invitations to company dinners, vague excuses about estate planning being too complicated right now. And always, my half-sister, Tessa, his youngest, from a second marriage, lurking in the background like a shadow waiting to step into the light. Tessa was 26, charming, beautiful, and ruthless in the kind of way that makes people believe she's just ambitious. She was the kind of woman who posted polished Instagram photos of champagne flutes and Ferris wheel kisses without ever mentioning whose money paid for them. And she was always just helping out at the company, never working, but always around. Still, I never imagined she'd steal the one person I believed would never betray me. Elliot Graves. Elliot was a junior partner at a law firm downtown. We'd been together for 4 years, the kind of man who opened doors, sent flowers on Tuesdays just because, and knew how I took my coffee before I told him. Or at least, that's who he was when I still saw him through rose-colored glasses. Looking back, there were signs. How he started missing our Wednesday dinners, claiming depositions ran long. How his phone always faced screen down. How Tessa suddenly started defending him whenever I got upset. "You're just stressed, Carrie. Don't project onto him. He's amazing." Maybe I was afraid to look closer because, deep down, I already knew. Maybe I didn't want to lose the one person who made me feel like I wasn't invisible in my own family. The day before the wedding, we held the rehearsal dinner at my father's estate, the same estate where I used to play hide and seek in my Sunday dress while my dad sipped bourbon with board members on the back patio. The air smelled like gardenias and grilled steak, and everything looked perfect from the outside. That's what made it worse. Because behind every polite smile was a secret, and mine was about to explode. I went upstairs to grab the ring box Elliot had left in my car. I took the long way through the house to avoid the caterers, through the study where the lights were still on. That's when I saw them. Tessa in Elliot's lap, his mouth brushing her collarbone, her laugh like nails on velvet. And my father? Just sitting there, nodding like this was a normal family discussion. My heels clicked on the wood floor louder than I expected, and all three heads turned toward me. My breath caught. Carrie! Elliot stood up too fast, his hand still tangled in Tessa's hair. This isn't what it looks like. But it was. And my father's words? They sliced deeper than any affair could. It's already been decided. As if my heart wasn't even on the table. But what I didn't know yet, what would make my world truly collapse, was that it wasn't just my engagement they'd taken. It was my future, my inheritance, my place in the company. The will had been changed, quietly, legally, permanently. And I wasn't even listed as a beneficiary anymore. But that discovery would come later. For now, I stood there in my mint green dress, holding a bouquet I hadn't realized I dropped, watching the man I loved and the sister I never trusted steal the life I'd built right in front of my eyes. And that was only the beginning. I didn't cry when I walked out of that study. I didn't scream or throw anything. I didn't even say a word. I just walked past Elliot, past Tessa, past my father, and the wall of Monroe family portraits, glaring down at me like I'd just failed them all. I got in my car, wedding dress still hanging in the back seat, and drove. I didn't even know where I was going until I hit the old causeway and pulled off onto the overlook where my mother used to take me when I had nightmares as a kid. The air smelled like salt and crushed pine needles. I sat on the hood of my car until sunrise, staring at the water and waiting to feel something. Anything, but all I felt was hollow. Like someone had carved out my heart and left an echo in its place. The wedding never happened. The Monroe estate staff quietly cleared away the white garden chairs and rose-covered arch before any guests arrived. No announcements were made, no apologies were offered. Just a text from my father's assistant. Per Mr. Monroe's direction, all plans have been suspended indefinitely. That was it. 48 hours later, Elliot and Tessa were photographed at brunch together in downtown Charleston, holding hands and laughing. The caption on the local society page read, "Southern Power, couple in the making." Meanwhile, I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Rebecca, my best friend since college, tried to come over. I didn't answer the door. I ignored every call. The silence was easier than trying to explain something I barely understood myself. But then came the second blow, the one that really broke me. I got a letter from the firm managing my trust, the one my mother had set up for me before she died of breast cancer when I was 17. It was brief, cold, legal. Per the executed amendment of the Randolph-Monroe estate, your beneficiary status has been formally revoked. All financial assets, land titles, and business interests now fall under the sole discretion of the listed successor, Ms. Tessa, Monroe. I read it 3 times before the words made sense. Then I threw up in my bathroom sink. He hadn't just taken my fiancé, he'd taken everything. The land my mother planted wild azaleas on. The scholarship fund I was going to launch for my students. The summer cabin in Lake Jocassee where we used to roast marshmallows and watch meteor showers. Gone. All of it. Signed over to Tessa like I was never meant to have it in the first place. I stormed into my father's office the next morning, still in sweatpants, no makeup, hair in a knot so tight it hurt. He barely looked up from his desk. "You changed the will," I said. My voice didn't even sound like mine. "You disinherited me without a word." His answer was slow and deliberate. "I did what was best for the legacy of this family." I laughed. Loud, bitter. "You mean Tessa's legacy?" He set down his pen and finally met my eyes. "She has vision, Carrie. She understands where we're headed. You've always been content in small places. Your counseling job, your hobbies. That's not leadership. That's not leadership," I snapped. "It's called having a soul. It's called lacking ambition," he said calmly. "This is a business, not a charity. Tessa knows how to play the game." That was when it hit me. He'd never believed in me. Not once. Everything he ever gave me came with invisible strings. I wasn't a daughter, I was a placeholder. And now that Tessa had grown into the image of the perfect Monroe heiress, I was expendable. I left his office with shaking hands and drove straight to my mother's grave. It was in a little corner of the family plot. No one visited anymore. I hadn't been there in months, maybe years. I dropped to my knees and sobbed like a child. "I'm sorry," I whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I tried. I really tried." I don't know how long I stayed there, but the sun was setting by the time I got up. That week, the whispers began. I walked into my local grocery store, and 2 women at the bakery counter stopped talking mid-sentence. One gave me a pitying smile. The other looked away. People knew. Somehow the story had twisted into something ugly rumors that I had left Elliot at the altar, that I'd had a breakdown, that Tessa had stepped in to save the family reputation. Even the woman at the dry cleaner gave me a strange look when I picked up my clothes. "Hope you're feeling better, honey," she said gently. "Weddings are stressful." The humiliation wasn't just in my home anymore. It was in the air I breathed. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was watching my own funeral. I stopped going out. I let emails pile up. I turned down a promotion offer from my school district without even reading the full memo. I didn't know how to face a world that thought I was the villain of my own story. Or worse, the girl who just couldn't hold on to her man or her money. The worst part? I started to believe it. Maybe I was too soft. Maybe I'd wasted years thinking that goodness mattered more than strategy. That love was enough to protect me from power-hungry wolves wearing designer smiles. Maybe my father was right. Maybe I was built for small things. But even as I withered behind blackout curtains and unanswered texts, a tiny voice inside me kept whispering, "This isn't the end. This is the beginning." I just didn't know it yet. 3 weeks after the wedding that never was, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping the windows, like a drumbeat that wouldn't let me sleep through it anymore. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lightning flash, no grand epiphany, just a slow, dull ache that had hardened into something else, something colder. I stood in the hallway of my quiet house, barefoot, coffee in hand, staring at the family portrait my father had gifted me for my college graduation. He was in the center, holding Tessa on one side, me on the other. I realized something for the first time. I didn't belong in that frame. Not really. I was always the second draft, the backup plan, and they had thrown me out like a pen that stopped writing. I took the photo off the wall and opened the back of the frame. Tucked inside was a note my mother had written, yellowing with age. For Caroline, if the world ever turns against you, remember who you are and who I raised you to be. Her handwriting shook slightly at the end. She'd written it when she was sick. That was the push I needed. That same afternoon, I drove to a law office I hadn't been to since I was 18, James and Barrett, LLP, where my mother's estate had been managed before my father moved everything to his high-powered corporate attorneys. I asked for her old probate lawyer, Gregory James, only to be told he passed away 3 years ago. But someone else stepped forward from the back room, a woman with salt and pepper hair, wide eyes, and a voice that sounded like she hadn't forgotten a thing in 30 years. "You're Caroline," she said slowly, walking toward me with a curious warmth. "My name's Maggie Kane. I used to work with your mother every week before she passed. Come in, honey." Maggie's office smelled like old paper and lavender. She offered me tea, but I refused. I needed answers. I told her everything almost everything, about the will, the disinheritance, Tessa, the silence in my father's eyes. She listened without interrupting, nodding slowly like she already knew. When I finished, she reached for a green file folder on a back shelf. "Your mama came here on her last week of chemo," she said quietly. She was worried. She said Randolph was starting to talk strange, about streamlining the estate, about protecting the family name. She made me promise something. I haven't had the heart to open this since. She slid the folder across the desk. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter. My mother's handwriting again, more deliberate this time, more formal. "To my daughter, Caroline, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong." Beneath the letter was a copy of a supplemental trust clause, one I had never seen, with my mother's signature and date of filing. It designated me as the protected beneficiary of the Monroe Foundation in perpetuity. It included land holdings, intellectual property rights, and a 17% equity stake in Monroe Timber and Export. It was ironclad, legal, witnessed, but never activated. "Your father didn't file it with the new estate documents," Maggie said. "It's not in the version he submitted when he restructured everything with his lawyers after your mother passed." "So he buried it," I whispered. "Pretended it didn't exist?" Maggie nodded. "He likely assumed no one would remember it existed until it was too late. But it was properly notarized, filed. He couldn't delete it, only override it. And even that's messy." I stared at the paper, my pulse pounding. "So, what does this mean? Can I fight it? With the right lawyer and the right leverage. You can do more than fight it, honey. You can unravel the whole damn thing." That night, I sat in my living room with the folders spread across the floor, scanning every clause, every legal term. My mother hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a key, a blueprint, a way out. I lit one of her old vanilla-scented candles, the kind she used to keep in our kitchen, and read her letter again. The last line pierced straight through me. "If they ever try to replace you, make sure they regret it." And for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The next morning, I went to see Rebecca. I owed her an apology for shutting her out. She opened the door in pajama pants and hugged me like she thought I'd died. "Don't say anything," I whispered into her hair. I'm here now." We sat on her back porch, drinking coffee while cicadas chirped in the background. I told her about the trust clause, about Maggie, about what I was going to do. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked, concern thick in her voice. "This isn't just a comeback, Carrie. This is war." I looked out across her yard at the garden we used to tend together every spring. Then I guess it's time I stopped playing nice. I began making a list. People who still owed me favors. Former employees at the Monroe company who had quietly disappeared after Tessa came in. A real estate attorney I used to babysit for in high school. And Maggie, who, as it turned out, had kept her notary license just in case. Piece by piece, I started building my case. But I didn't want to go public. Not yet. I wanted every move to be quiet, untraceable. I wasn't going to confront them. I was going to box them in, force their hand. One signature at a time, one discovery at a time, until they realized the little girl they once underestimated had grown claws. The pain was still there, of course. I still cried sometimes, especially at night. I still deleted photos of me and Elliot from my phone, my fingers hesitating over each one like they were tiny betrayals all over again. But something had shifted. I was no longer sitting in my grief. I was standing on it. And I was going to use every shattered piece to build a path forward. The first blow didn't come from a courtroom. It came from the school board. Just 2 weeks after Maggie helped me submit the petition to reintroduce my mother's trust clause into the estate proceedings, I was called into the principal's office. Not as a counselor, but as a concern. The district superintendent was there too, his posture stiff, his smile fake. "Carrie," he said carefully, "we've had a few inquiries about your professional and personal conduct. Given your current family dispute being in legal motion and the press's interest in the Monroe estate, we think it might be best if you take some personal time." Translation: My father made a phone call. I felt my face flush with anger, but I stayed calm. "My dispute with the Monroe estate has nothing to do with my work here." "We understand," the principal said, "but perception matters, and the board doesn't want any distractions for the students." I looked the superintendent dead in the eye. "So, because I'm standing up to my father quietly, I might add, you're benching me?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That afternoon, I cleaned out my office. The handmade cards from my 8th graders, the potted plant, from our janitor, Mrs. Elkins, the framed picture of my first graduating class, all of it into boxes like I'd been fired. I wasn't angry at the school. I was angry at how quickly my father's influence had poisoned the soil I'd planted roots in. He hadn't just removed me from the family. Now, he wanted me erased from everything else, too. The second attack was financial. A week later, I got a notification from my bank. 2 of my linked accounts, ones originally connected to the Monroe Family Fund, were frozen. Pending ownership review, the bank said. The timing wasn't coincidence. My father was trying to choke me out. I rushed to Maggie's office, paper in hand, my voice shaking with frustration. "Can he do this?" I asked. "He can try," she said, "but we've already filed. He's panicking. That's a good thing. Means we're getting to him." It doesn't feel good, I muttered. It feels like drowning. Maggie gave me a long look and placed a gentle hand over mine. He's used to people folding. You don't fold, Carrie. You push harder. But pushing wasn't easy. That night, I broke down in my mother's old room, the one my father had converted into a wine cellar the year after she died. I sat on the floor and pulled out a box of her keepsakes I'd hidden in my own closet years ago. Inside was a faded handkerchief, a locket with a tiny photo of me as a toddler, and a notebook labeled Legacy Notes. Flipping through it felt like reading a private map. There were outlines for charity events she'd planned, handwritten reminders. Talk to Maggie about filing amendments. Carrie, sear integrity. Randolph, leverage. That last one stopped me cold. Leverage. She had always known he couldn't be trusted fully. She just never had time to fight him. But I did. And then came the public threat. It arrived not as a message to me, but to the press. A short statement released by the Monroe legal team. Recent rumors regarding Ms. Caroline Monroe's claim to the estate are categorically false. Mr. Monroe acted within full legal rights and has supported his daughters equally throughout their lives. Any suggestion otherwise is an unfortunate mischaracterization by a third party. They had erased me with a paragraph. Again, but this time they made a mistake. They underestimated the people still loyal to me. Rebecca, who had stayed quiet until now, posted a message on her personal blog one that had over 15,000 followers. The truth is messy, but I watched a woman lose everything she built because of lies, legacy, and greed. And I can tell you, Carrie Monroe didn't walk away. She was shoved. The post went viral overnight. Then came more. A former Monroe executive anonymously emailed me stating, Tessa had been funneling personal expenses, cosmetic treatments, designer purchases through the company's charity wing. Another whistleblower sent me proof that Elliot had backdated legal documentation around the trust revision. Photos, receipts, emails. Maggie and I compiled everything into a growing case file we nicknamed Restoration. Still, the fear was real. I started waking up in cold sweats. I kept my front porch lights on through the night. At one point, I caught a man sitting in a black SUV outside my house for 45 minutes. He never got out, but he didn't leave either. When I finally walked outside, phone in hand, he rolled away without a word. When I told Maggie, she went pale. You need to be careful, she warned. You're not just rattling cages now. You're shaking the whole damn tree. So I bought security cameras, changed my locks, and kept going. Because I had learned something about myself in those long, painful nights. I wasn't just fighting for what was taken from me. I was fighting for who I was supposed to become. And no one was going to write my ending for me again. The invitation arrived by courier, as if they wanted to dare me to come. A thick ivory envelope embossed with gold foil. The Monroe Foundation honors Tessa Monroe. A legacy continued. Date: September 10th. Location: the Charleston Opera Hall. Dress code: black tie. Optional. Media: presence. Expected. It wasn't just a party. It was a coronation. A public declaration that Tessa had won, that she was the new face of the Monroe dynasty, that I never existed. But I wasn't going to sit in the dark while they burned my name into dust. So I RSVP'd through a third party, secured a ticket under my mother's maiden name, booked a dress fitting with a seamstress who owed me a favor. Then I called Maggie and Rebecca. It's time, I said. I'm going to light the match. The day of the gala arrived humid and heavy, the kind of low country night where even secrets can't breathe. The opera hall glittered with people in designer gowns and rented tuxedos, champagne flowing like entitlement itself. The Monroe banner hung 30 feet high across the back curtain. The press lined the carpet. And in the center of it, all stood Tessa, dripping in diamonds, her hair twisted into a regal updo, Elliot at her side, like a prince who'd stolen the wrong kingdom. I entered quietly, just before the main program began. Heads turned slowly, some in recognition, others in whispered confusion. Was that Carrie Monroe? Didn't she disappear? I didn't speak. Not yet. I waited until Tessa stepped to the podium to deliver her speech. She started with a laugh. Thank you all for being here tonight. It means so much to me and to my father that you've stood by our family during a time of transition. I saw Randolph nod from the front row, smug and serene. I only hope to honor this legacy with grace and integrity. And that's when the screen behind her flickered. Once, twice. Then it changed completely. Photos appeared first. Tessa's personal expenses, charged to Monroe Foundation's philanthropic account. A $7,500 charity dinner at a five-star spa in Savannah. An $11,000 invoice for medical outreach that was actually her plastic surgeon's office. The room gasped. Then came Elliot's part. Emails between him and Monroe attorneys. Backdated signatures. A message where he wrote, "We can bury the trust clause. No one's watching anymore." Then came the final blow. My mother's letter. In her own handwriting. Across the 20-foot screen. Every person in that hall read the line I had memorized like scripture. If they ever try to replace you, make sure they regret it. I stepped forward. No mic, no spotlight. Just me and the fire I'd been tending for months. Good evening, I said softly. My name is Caroline Monroe. Some of you may remember me as Randolph's daughter. Others may only know the version of the story that's been fed to the press. Let me give you the truth. Security hesitated. Randolph stood up, his face pale with fury. "Turn that off," he barked. But no one moved, because the truth had weight now. Evidence, witnesses, legitimacy. My mother, Elise Monroe, filed a supplemental trust clause before her death. It was buried, erased, just like I was. And in the process, this company has committed fraud, misused funds, and manipulated legal records to crown an heiress who bought her throne with other people's bones. I locked eyes with Tessa. She looked like she couldn't breathe. You used to be my sister, I said. Now, you're just someone I used to protect. I pulled the microphone from the stand. To every donor, board member, and media outlet here tonight, I have filed formal motions with the South Carolina Attorney General's office to audit Monroe Foundation's finances. I have opened an ethics complaint against Elliot Graves with the state bar. And I have reinstated my claim to the Monroe estate under rightful beneficiary status, supported by original documentation and verified witnesses. Gasps echoed across the marble hall. You wanted a legacy, Tessa, I said. Well, here it is, in real time. And it's burning. Rebecca stood up and began clapping. One by one, others joined her. Some out of shock. Some out of support. Some simply because they realized they were standing in a historic moment, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of history. Randolph turned to storm out, but not before I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You once told me I lacked ambition. Turns out I just lacked patience." The media didn't waste a second. Reporters rushed the exit. Cameras flashed like lightning. By the time I reached the parking garage, Carrie Monroe was trending on X, and someone had already uploaded a video titled Southern Cinderella Exposes Family at Gala. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just sat in my living room with Maggie and Rebecca, drinking boxed wine and watching the chaos ripple across the internet like waves after an explosion. "They'll come for you harder now," Maggie warned gently. "I know," I said, "but at least now, they'll have to look me in the eye when they do." The fallout started within 48 hours. The Monroe Foundation released a statement that read more like a surrender letter than a defense. Tessa Monroe, due to internal investigation, was placed on immediate leave pending audit results. Donors began withdrawing. Quietly, then in droves. 2 corporate sponsors publicly condemned the misuse of charitable funds. Her portrait, which had hung in the foundation lobby for less than a week, was removed by maintenance staff before sunrise. On Monday, she went dark on social media. No beach selfies, no grind don't stop. Quotes in perfectly staged lighting. Just silence. Word eventually spread that she'd left Charleston altogether and retreated to her mother's property in Asheville. The last thing I heard, she was seeking spiritual reconnection through a guided mountain retreat. I almost laughed. Almost. Elliot didn't get a mountain retreat. The South Carolina Bar Association sent me a formal notice thanking me for my submission and informing me that an ethics review panel had opened an active investigation into backdating legal documents and client misconduct. His law firm removed his bio from their website. Quietly, but definitively. When I passed his office building later that week, his name had been scraped off the glass. Just a blank space where Elliot Graves-esque used to be. A blank space, fitting for a man who had stood beside me for 4 years and disappeared the moment I needed truth. Randolph didn't speak to the press. Of course he didn't. He was old Southern money, the kind that believed silence was stronger than scandal. But his silence became the loudest confession of all. Board members called for an internal governance review. His influence, once untouchable, began to tarnish under the weight of exposed secrets. And for the first time in my life, people stopped looking at him like a titan. They started seeing the man behind the myth, the man who had gambled his legacy on the wrong heir. And what did I get? The trust clause was upheld, my stake in the company restored. I received an official letter from Monroe legal representatives acknowledging omitted documents previously thought to be superseded. It was their way of saying, "You were right," without having to kneel. I also got calls, a dozen of them, from journalists, activists, even a professor at Vanderbilt who wanted me to speak on gendered erasure and power inheritance. They all wanted the story, but I wasn't ready to hand it over. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the courtroom victories and media frenzy, something deeper had settled inside me. Something no court ruling could resolve. A grief that didn't have a name. It hit me late one evening while cleaning out my mother's old cedar chest. I found an envelope I had missed, tucked between pressed lilies and faded Polaroids. It was addressed simply, "Carrie, if the world gets loud." Inside was a single sentence, written in her loopy, graceful hand. "Sometimes the fight makes you forget who you were before it began. Don't let it." I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and cried for everything that had been lost. Not just the betrayal, not just the erasure, but the woman I had been before all of this. The one who believed family meant safety. The one who believed love could protect you. The one who still bought birthday cards for people who'd stopped remembering hers. Victory was supposed to taste sweet, but it didn't. Not yet. I visited Maggie the next day and handed her the original trust document, creased and stained from months of clutching. "Frame it," she said, smiling softly. "It's your mother's voice. Her signature was her sword." I nodded. It saved me. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life swinging it. Maggie watched me carefully. "So what will you do now?" I thought about that question for a long time. Not just that afternoon, but every day afterward. Because winning isn't the same as healing, and justice doesn't always come with peace. But I knew one thing. If they thought they had broken me, they hadn't even seen the woman I was becoming. 6 months later, I stood barefoot on the front porch of a modest blue bungalow nestled on the edge of Avondale. It wasn't the Monroe estate. It didn't have iron gates, sprawling gardens, or a portrait gallery of ancestors no one remembered. But it was mine, paid for with my own money, in my name, on my terms. I'd sold my stake in the family business, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I didn't want to fight over boardrooms and timber stocks for the rest of my life. I didn't want to be a symbol of their shame or a constant reminder of their mistakes. I wanted to be someone else, someone better. With part of the funds, I started the Elise Grace Foundation, a scholarship and mentorship program for girls who'd been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked in schools, homes, and communities. We hosted our first workshop at the same middle school where I once handed out granola bars and tissues to crying 8th graders. Rebecca helped me design the website. Maggie joined the board. And the first time I watched one of our students get into a college no one thought she could afford, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not vengeance, not triumph, just peace. Some days, I still get messages from people who followed the scandal like it was a soap opera. "You were so brave. You destroyed them. You're iconic." I smile at the compliments, but I don't dwell there. Because this story was never about revenge. It was about remembrance. Remembering who I was before they told me I wasn't enough. Remembering my mother's softness and her strength. Remembering that survival isn't just clawing your way out of the fire. It's learning to plant again in the ashes. Randolph never reached out. Not after the gala. Not after the lawsuit was settled. The last I heard, he was still trying to salvage his board seats while quietly funding a legacy rebranding campaign. Tessa reemerged on social media 6 months later under a new handle. Just Tess. She posted a photo of herself doing yoga with a caption about forgiveness being the real wealth. It got 12 likes and a sea of eye rolls. Elliot moved to Atlanta. He hasn't practiced law since. Someone told me he opened a boutique co-working space and hosts emotional accountability circles for men in tech. If that's redemption, I hope it works for him. But it has nothing to do with me anymore. People often ask if I've forgiven them. The honest answer? No. Because forgiveness isn't an obligation, it's a process. And sometimes it starts with forgiving yourself first, for not seeing the signs, for giving too much, for holding on longer than you should have. And when I finally forgave myself for staying silent, for shrinking, for trusting people who never deserved me, I found that I no longer needed their apologies. I walk through the world differently now, not guarded, but grounded. I say no without guilt. I protect my peace like it's sacred, because it is. And when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who kept going when everything told her to fold. That's the story I tell the girls in our mentorship sessions. Not the scandal, not the headlines, but the story of a woman who was supposed to vanish and didn't. Because life will try to erase you sometimes, with silence, with shame, with 1,000 cuts that don't bleed, but scar. But if you keep showing up, if you remember who you are, even when they pretend to forget, you will outlive every attempt they make to break you. My name is Caroline Monroe, and I was never the wrong bride. They just chose the wrong woman to betray.